Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. When I opened up my email this morning, there was a message from a former client, which thankfully this type of message is something that is extraordinarily rare, but despite a lack of contact for many years, for some reason, perhaps prompted by Mercury retrograde, she decided that today was the day to detail how invalid and unkind and reprehensible my way of being in the world was, and in conclusion to express, a sort of condescending pity for my limitations and gratefulness that she wasn't like me. And I thought back. I hadn't thought about her in a very long time. She had just terminated abruptly, which I knew she was triggered with me, and I totally honored that. I'd set a boundary. She didn't like the boundary. She decided not to work with me anymore. I was cool with that. I really respected and honored it, took her off all my lists, tried to make sure I didn't, accidentally email her in any way, and went on with being in service to the people that I was working with. So all these years went by, and then, here's this letter. And I had a number of different reactions. One of them was just really pure compassion for her. I remember having that way of being in the world. So I kind of want to unpack it, because unfortunately I could find how much it showed up for me back in the day. And I could find where, it's still something that unfortunately, can show up even here and now if I'm not paying attention or on my game. So the gist of the interaction is we get our feelings hurt in some way. There's something we want from someone that they're a no to, they're not available for, that we expected to get a yes, that we felt like we were owed a yes even. And then in sitting with the feelings that arise because their way of moving and being in the world was different than what we expected and wanted and felt entitled to, we perhaps sit and stew. I know I did a lot of this back in the day on, really reorganizing and recapitulating and ruminating on all the data and conveniently throwing out all the data points that disagree with my kind of overarching thesis that their way of being in the world is invalid. And I, in my mind and heart, come up with more and more extreme language and more kind of reorganizing the facts. There's this whole mental, kind of exercise where in order to avoid just sitting with disappointment or hurt or grief, because, one of the things I worked really hard on in therapy was how good I am at emotionally avoiding. And a lot of times when people are doing this, myself included, and it's a touchy shadow place to really look at, to really look in the mirror on, because I think we tend to find these moments so painful that we really don't want to dwell on them. And sometimes it's a movement where we might beat up on ourselves or find our own way of being in the world invalid or not okay or not good enough. And one of the movements, if you haven't done shadow work to treat yourself with unconditional friendliness, is to then go into the whole process of finding someone else's way of being in the world invalid and not right, and going into that kind of judgment out of pain that ends up being a psychological move to move out of pain or shock or some other emotion that's really uncomfortable. We get a lot more biochemical rewards for righteous indignation and anger than we do for grief or sadness. Those things don't feel particularly good. The trigger of feeling something we don't want to feel and moving into some kind of internal strategy to shift away from that raw pain point can happen so fast. And that was part of why I did as much work as I did in therapy, because I just wasn't successfully making and sustaining relationships. I had such a longing to connect, such a longing to be close to people, and there wasn't really a kind of an off-the-shelf answer because I'm kind of a weird and wacky person. I really have needs of depth and authenticity and congruence are things that are really important to me. And one of the things I noticed was, that pretty much any way I looked at it, the lack of success was coming down to my lack of social skills. And so I did a lot of really deep, vulnerable, at times excruciating, at times really beautiful work to really wrangle that part of myself that could jump so quickly into judgment or spinning a story of entitlement. They owed this to me. And darned if it didn't come and bite me in the ass recently. I had a friends with benefits, let's call it. It was genuine friendship, somebody I'd known, at least in my mind, somebody I'd known for a lot of years. We had been intimate in the past. Many years had gone by. We stayed friends on Facebook. I don't tend to like slash and burn unless, the ending is really painful and unpleasant. And it wasn't. He just wasn't available. Things stopped. And then we got back in touch. And he wanted to spend time with me. I thought that was lovely. He was smart, a good conversationalist. I genuinely enjoyed his company. It wasn't anything that had this real depth or being met or deeper romantic feelings, but I really enjoyed the genuine connection and friendliness, and it was really nice up until the point that he just stopped responding to my texts. And I gave it a little while. Hey, maybe he's busy, maybe something else is going on. If I'm being really honest, which I think is useful in this forum, I was kind of not that sad if he went away. There were just places where kind of the initial excitement had faded and I was still enjoying him, but I wasn't as into it. So I gave it a good bit of time, and then I was like, it would be good to get closure. So I reached out and I said, just simple text, hey, clear is kind. I really value closure. It seems like you've had a shift in your mind and heart related to me. Can we have a conversation and figure out? I totally honor whatever your truth is. Real simple. I really value people coming to me in personal relationship. I also value when people who've projected something onto me just take their toys and go home and unfriend me on Facebook if it's not a close relationship. But, if it is a friendship and it is something meaningful, I do want to hear if a lover no longer wants to be my lover. And so I take pains. I know not everybody does, but I take pains to be someone who's safe to tell something that the other person might not want to hear. It's kind of a way of, being a good place. At the same time, everybody has the history they do. And unfortunately, I got no reply to that. Waited about a month, followed up and said, hey, it's just so painful when someone ends an intimate relationship by just never talking to me again, by just not responding. That hurt, and again, crickets, absolutely no response. And what I know about ruminating on someone else's way of being in the world, being invalid, is that it's really an energy leak. And what would have been healthier for me to stay with is the question of, wow, how do I move through the sadness and the surprise and the disappointment and the feeling that something I just genuinely didn't see it coming. One of my strategies for not getting blindsided, which works a lot of the time, but not all of the time, is to have a lot of discernment about people. And I just didn't expect that of him. I didn't exactly think he was a paragon of not being someone who was hugely conflict avoidant or, kind of out for his own hedonism and pleasure and, just what was best for him. It wasn't that I didn't think that, but I didn't think it extended to this degree. And so what would have been more functional for me in this situation would have just been to come to the place of processing the emotions that I had about this and coming home to myself and noticing that, the people I've built really lasting, sustainable friendships share this value with me. They don't, end up, handling things in this way. And so that would have been, what I would have liked to have imagined that my head did. But darned if I didn't catch myself quite a number of times creating that case for how he was morally reprehensible and his way of being in the world was invalid and he sucked and how could you do such a thing? And at the end of the day, one of my biggest pet peeves is when someone feels entitled to my time, attention, and energy. And from my point of view, opinions obviously differ. There are plenty of people who probably have run up against me setting and holding a boundary who would absolutely dispute this. But I try to give as generously as I can in a way that doesn't deplete me or hurt me or make my life harder. So if I can, I will. I come to interactions with as much generosity, but I really am careful about not over-giving so that I don't have strings attached or expectations about the future or making my journey harder because of something that I'm supplying to somebody without an energy exchange of some kind. And that could be an energy exchange that shows up in friendship. I have a lot of very mutual friendships, or an energy exchange that shows up with a client who pays me for my services. But I'm just aware of when I'm going above and beyond the sustainability of that. So I don't build that kind of resentment and entitlement. But gosh darn it, if I didn't have the story that this dude owed it to me to have that, I changed my mind conversation instead of just never speaking to me again. Never's an extreme word. I just want to acknowledge that because who knows, a month from now he could end up reaching out and apologizing. But for me, in the midst of my story about this, that's the language that comes to mind. So I'm kind of calling myself out and illuminating it here because I think it's useful to show those parts of ourselves that sometimes we kind of want to keep hidden, sometimes don't look as attractive. And I generally do really, really well with not spinning into these narratives where I'm analyzing someone's way of being in the world, throwing out all the data points that don't agree with my hypothesis, because humans are good at dramatic stories. We suck at statistics. We really have to do an override of our mind to be pragmatic. And when emotion is running high, there are big biological rewards for picking enemy or friend. Brené Brown talks about this really beautifully, where our instinct mind doesn't like ambiguity. It doesn't like shades of gray. It doesn't like, well, we were really aligned in this way, but their way of handling this thing doesn't work for me. Once I'm over my hurt feelings, I'll see if there's a place that I can work with that, or if we just need to be done. Like, that would be a really balanced way of looking at it intellectually. But when emotions are running high, there's a vulnerability to this creation of narrative. And I've lived it and I get it, so I have a lot of compassion for why good people sit around and make increasingly elaborate and detailed stories of how bad and wrong other people are. And we all probably know someone in that really extreme case where, decades after the fact, their favorite topic of conversation is still how their ex-husband or partner done them wrong, how horrible they are, how rotten they are. And if you've ever entertained listening to someone tell their victim story with increasing refinement and recapitulation way more times than you were interested in hearing, there's a really good chance that this is someone who, if they get triggered with another person, they have this really disproportional response. So there's kind of an emotional hostage holding, which I wasn't doing on purpose in my 20s, but absolutely was true of me, that if my feelings got bruised a little bit, as one person put it, retroactively after I'd done some therapy and I could really find it, I was so thin-skinned I would bleed in a high wind. And I could find that to be true. And so when someone says no to someone who's in that place, there's this wildly intense emotional reaction that makes us often not set boundaries with these people until we're so frigging fed up with them that we don't frigging care if they leave the relationship forever. There's kind of this, place where there's that, if I tell my truth, if I speak up, they're going to be so wildly triggered with me that there'll just be so much misery to that we don't do it until we're ready to end the relationship. Now, there are other people who haven't sat their butt down in therapy who are just so conflict avoidant that they won't bring something up, even if the person is a really soft place to land, even if they've done the inner work to create a genuine receptivity to hearing what's going on for someone in an important relationship. So just because you've cultivated the health and the openness and the availability, like I'm giving the example of this, guy who just wouldn't break up with me, just stopped talking to me, no matter how gracefully I would conduct that conversation and honoring I would have been with him and desiring to have a graceful ending and honor what went before and leave with respect and affinity intact and having a whole skill set to make that happen. He had whatever history and emotional stack and life experiences and probably women who, didn't take, I've had a change of heart, I don't want to be involved with you very well in the past. And so there's kind of two sides to this. And I just, I think for people who are like me, there's a desire to kind of control our results. And we really like tending to our side of the street. And the truth of it is, for relationships are hard. We can boundary with people, we can move with discernment, but this whole intimate, connected, human relating thing is hard and messy because the other person and what they show up with really does impact our results. So I just want to be really clear in sharing all of this, that no matter how effective you are at kind of doing this inner work, it doesn't translate into a freedom from these kind of dynamics. So when I got this email, telling me how, terrible a person I was and such, I went internally and I really reviewed. I hadn't thought about it in a very long time, but I remembered the incident. And from my point of view, it was a place where she was going through a really hard thing. And she tried to push a boundary, and I compassionately said, I'm so sorry, I can't and won't. I suppose I could have, but I wasn't available to collapse that boundary. And I gave her a lot of options and choices and ways that we could get to a win-win. And for whatever reason in that moment, she wanted it all her way, and her way wasn't good for me. And I told her no. And I really get that nobody likes to hear no. No just sucks. If we really want something, especially if the desire is really intense and we get a no, that doesn't feel good. And the more emotional stack we're carrying, the more, emotions that are layered, the harder it is to kind of be an adult and say, well, humans have free choice. If this person isn't available for something, I honor that. And gosh darn it, I could so find the times when I was younger, I'm going back to my high school years, where I tended to do a lot of creating connection with my, powers of empathy and support and being in your corner. And so I tended to be the best person in the world to talk to, if you were having a hard day. So compassionate, so supportive, because that was how I knew to make a compassionate connection. In fact, I ended a really significant friendship not that long ago. We're talking, in my 40s, some years ago, because I was tired of being what I called the stormy weather friend, by which I meant that I was on speed dial for this gal when she was having a hard time. And I loved supporting her in that way. I really cared about her. But when it was time to find people to do things that were playful and to have parties, I wasn't the top of her list. I wasn't not on her list, but she wasn't the first person that she thought of for playfulness and fun. And there were other mismatches. I'm not particularly fond of drugs. That was a much bigger part of her partying experience in, very thoughtful, mindful ways. But nonetheless, I tend to stay sober at parties, and the friends who don't need to be embracing of that truth for me. And, lots of different aspects to this. But going back to those teenage years, I would spend hours and hours and hours at recess, supporting. And then when I would have a bad day, I would believe that I just had such a line of credit with this person that of course they would drop everything and of course they would listen and be compassionate. And they did a little bit of that, but it really wasn't their gig. It wasn't their jam. It wasn't who they were in the world. So when I was kind of a bummer over time and having big emotions and they didn't really know what to say, they went and found somebody else to have a different experience with. And oh my goodness, was I, indignant and hurt and felt done wrong. And in retrospect, I wish I could go back and, hug that teenage me and say, oh, honey, it'll be so good when you have more functional ways of seeing the world. Because in my life now, I really do have enormously supportive people who really do have tremendous availability and tremendous compassion when I'm going through something, but I'm not setting up those kind of codependent relationships of getting attention and engagement by overgiving and overfunctioning, because when you do that with someone who's underfunctioning, they may just not have it in the tank to give. The minute you're unavailable as a source, people who are chronically in that place, and sometimes we're situationally in the place of underfunctioning, but people who are just constantly in that place are often, not always, but often very adept at going and finding someone to tell their victim story and their it's so hard to be me, and get all these, really compassionate, healing rescuer types to jump in. So I certainly had the experience of like, oh, this well isn't working right now. I'll go find another well, which kind of has a fundamental sanity to it. It's just that my trying to build mutual friendship with someone who was in that place wasn't really available. So I have a lot of points of discernment if I'm going to go deeper with someone and consider them a friend about, all of these distinctions, like what is their value for mutuality? How good are they at seeing the impact of their actions on others? Humans aren't that good at it, but some people are much more terrible about noticing the impact of their actions. And that was one of the saving graces for me, is that I was an engineering student. I do have a statistical mind. And when I had a lot of the same kind of experiences with different people, I was able to say, look, I'm the common denominator in this, so there must be something I'm doing to cause it. And I was willing and able to go to therapy very earnestly asking that question. And so one of the things that I moved through, there's a lot of things here for a lot of different people, and what aha you might get out of listening to me ramble about all of this could be wildly different depending on where you are. But one of the seeds that I want to plant in this is that if you're someone who carries the archetype of the healer, has depth of empathy and compassion, that may be a part of you that needs some adult supervision, because the person who you're allowing to treat you in a way that isn't okay with you out of this empathy and compassion has access to seeing a therapist, could go ask those questions. And if they're choosing not to, it may be necessary to let the chips fall where they may. So one of the reasons I wasn't like wildly hurt, and it could go either way, like if I'm in more of a stress state, somebody, telling their bad story about me and, gathering all the evidence, like I, like most people, really don't like being misinterpreted, not seen, not known. Again, going back to Katie in her 20s. The intensity of this was so great that, like, the partner that I was with, I would, literally follow him around the house yelling my truth, which does nothing to get you seen and heard as, gosh darn it, the good person you really know yourself to be that this person isn't seeing. So fortunately, I have more of a handle on that part of me that really places high value on feeling seen and heard and known, but it's still really high value. If we look at any of my successful, sustainable friendships, that's something that shows up in a really big way. It's still a big part of it, but I've kind of gathered the wherewithal that when that's not on the table, I can end up not stepping away rather than arguing with that reality or trying to get around it. And one of the things that was really nice for me about this moment is I was able to read that without a lot of trigger. So one of the things to notice if you have a really primal anxiety or stress reaction when somebody does this thing where they have made up the story of how your way of being in the world is invalid and wrong, and you get those results unfortunately delivered to you. I don't want people who I'm in really sustained relationship to not eventually come to me, but if there's a random person that really isn't in my inner circle who read something they didn't like on Facebook that I posted and spins into a whole discussion of this, I'd so rather they talked about me to other people rather than bringing that into my space. I've had very rarely, again, so little of this because I'm so clear about it, but there have been people that have been removed from being able to see what I post on Facebook, either completely or in personal ways, because they just had a trigger and decided that they should randomly tell me all about it, even though we had virtually no interaction. They weren't even a client or a student. But one of the things to kind of notice and pay attention to is if there is a primal fear, anxiety, stress response to that, that may be coming from your fight or flight being activated. And for sure, often somebody, out of the blue telling you how awful you are can totally activate that chemistry. And there've certainly been times when it got stirred up that way. I have done a tremendous amount of work not to run my fight or flight in activation, but one of the things that is important to know is that we have a lot of the same parts of our brain that light up with social rejection as we do with physical pain. And that's because as hunter-gatherer tribal people, humans have a really hard time surviving on their own. We have the illusion of it because of the modern infrastructure, but there's new research coming out that for older adults, loneliness can be as dangerous as smoking a pack a day for early mortality. And, that seems really crazy, but it just goes into how much of a stress state, how much we're wired for connection. And this isn't even like deep, meaningful connection. It's just like, yeah, the tribe generally likes me. They'll share their food. They'll help protect me. And so if you're already a little off your center, or your fight or flight is wound up, or you have a propensity for that, this additional trigger on top of that emotional stack can bring up a lot of not safe, not safe, not safe, which can create a feeling of tension and urgency to respond. And that response can either be indignantly doubling down on your position, or arguing, or capitulating, or people-pleasing. There are a lot of ways this can move, but what was really nice for me that happened in this particular case is my fight or flight's really chill right now. I've had some situations going on that are really tough, so I've been really doubling down on my practices as a result to keep that instinct activation not turned on. And so as a result, I didn't have the insanity of the instincts, which I always think are like a drunk person yelling bad advice in our ear, that isn't particularly helpful, but was good advice for surviving as a hunter-gatherer person. It's just bad advice for surviving as a person in the modern world. Our instincts literally will create tension for us not binge eating at times. There's just a lot of really not sustainable behaviors that they advocate. And again, I go into that. I have a whole program on instincts because I think they're so fascinating. And when you call them out, it's easier to manage and notice the tension. So if you have somebody who lashes out at you and you have this really big safety response, the invitation is, please, for your own sake, unless it's something that's in the moment where you can't get away before you respond. Brené Brown says this really succinctly, like, don't talk, don't text, don't type under the influence of this. So, if you can get away from the situation as gracefully as possible and then take the time that you need to regulate your nervous system. And you can even be really transparent about that. Like, wow, I'm having a lot of reaction to what you said, and I just need some time to calm the waters before I can respond in a reasonable and effective way. So really honoring, regulating your emotions, regulating your nervous system. So for me, fortunately, I didn't have to go through that step because it just didn't really ping my instincts. So I got to navigate this email coming in really from my heart chakra, my solar plexus, and my, you could call it third eye or crown chakra. So my heart chakra just really had so much compassion for this gal because I just think it's really hard to sustain relationships. And it's an interesting thing. I certainly use therapy in this way where I was having more success with the therapist that genuinely wanted to provide unconditional positive regard to me, no matter how clumsy and obstreperous and, loud my head was and what I was struggling with. There's a real generosity and beauty, and I love the opportunity to share that. So in working with this woman, I had genuine depth of compassion and wanting her to be well, and seeing this email that was the result of this obvious stewing on how my way of being in the world was invalid, followed by a years later follow-up of like, I'm gonna tell you how awful you were and how much you hurt me, and I'm glad I'm not that terrible person. I was just like, oh man, she's not, even after this really intense event passed, she's not going in and saying, let me look at this from another perspective. She's not doing a Byron Katie worksheet that allows her to get a wider perspective. She's not looking at her own behavior and questioning, did I participate in the most elegant way? She's really determined on her story that she was totally entitled to cross this boundary that I had clearly set because of the history we had. She'd been a client for a long time and she was going through something terrible. Ergo, she was entitled to cross the boundary of basically not paying me for my services and having some other elaborate plan. And I didn't agree. I wasn't available for that. And the thing was, at the time, I could see a whole bunch of different pathways where she could have paid me, but that wasn't what happened. But I had this compassion because I could find that in myself. I could find that times when I had all this tension of emotion and I wrote the email that I rewrote 10 times to have the perfect, here's how you hurt me and here's how you were wrong. And I'd feel the relief of tension when I told the person all the ways that I had, found them to be wrong and I had been hurt and they shouldn't do that. And then usually that resulted in people pulling back from the relationship really understandably when, all of this stuff came out. And for me, there was a cycle where I would send the email, I'd have some relief, and then there'd be all this tension about the person not responding and what are they going to say? And then the kind of the pain of whatever came back. And I can't recall a time where I wrote one of these epically long emails that I used to write in my 20s. I'd be really embarrassed if anyone saw my inbox for, especially men in my life. I was trying to relate to them with this massive wall of text where I was trying so hard to be heard in a medium that was completely unsuccessful. And it just never produced those results. And so I had the compassion for her. And then I checked in with myself. I'm like, okay, how do I feel about how I handled that? And I went, I really read this, not even necessarily about the money, but really about the boundary. And there was this boundary pushing, and I just wasn't available for it. I knew that I needed to be paid to show up in this really clear, heart-centered, I'm on your team. She had a lot going on. It was probably going to be a difficult session. And one of the things I've really had to work out is the part of me that wants to jump in to rescue and help and save and overgive. Like, that's a beautiful part of me. And it needs adult supervision, so it participates in a balanced way of like, well, what's it going to cost me? There were nights that I stayed up way too late because I had an emotionally unregulated and possibly drunk friend who just was going over and over and over, and I felt like I had to be there for them, even though, it was like I was giving up sleep I desperately needed in order to show up for that. When I look back to the years where I was carrying a lot of credit card debt, giving services away to loved ones for free instead of like sitting down and doing business development because I was so much more compelled, had a lot to do with that outcome. Not all of it. There's a whole complicated story to that, lots of layers, but that's for sure one of them. So I really checked in with my solar plexus. Like, how do I feel really looking in the mirror about my choices in that? And I'm like, yep, they're really congruent with what works for me. I can look in the mirror and say, yes, I did set this boundary. And yes, you found it really painful. You were really triggered by it. You felt entitled to something else. And I don't agree that you were entitled to that. And I think there's a power in that. Feedback from people is really complicated because when people are triggered, they're in their narrative, they aren't particularly balanced. Sometimes people have a really big agenda, you should do this for me and you're a horrible person if you don't. There's emotional hostage holding. I will have such a tantrum if you don't give me what I want. There's so much variety. And at the same time, I think if we're not noticing the impact that we have on other people and having a process to really feel into how we move through the world. Years ago as a teacher, I had a man who just so much boundary pushing and just very, very complicated relationship. And I ended up emailing him to say I can no longer be your teacher. And I don't regret that I started the conversation with an email. I certainly don't regret asking him to leave class. There was enormous feedback of the other women that were so relieved that his, healing was at front and center in our classroom. But I do regret that I didn't leave the door open to allow him to be heard and to have the conversation, that I didn't offer that labor to it. So there's a gentleness of my saying, yeah, that was 15 years ago. I was unskillful. He probably always would have been hurt and triggered. I heard through the grapevine, he was like, Katie did this horrible thing. And at the same time, I pretty much had the feeling that everybody kind of understood the complexity of this person. There was a lot of trigger with somebody who just was so longing for connection with women and so deeply angry at women all at the same time. Just really, really complicated situation. And so I think it's really useful, and I think it's useful to have facilitated feedback. I go to somebody who knows me really well, knows my blind spots, and I share what's going on, and he helps me to see my blind spots. And I have relationships with people with different perspectives. But there's a very kind of small list of people that I look to for feedback who understand the complexity of who I am and what I'm up to, who have thought as deeply about the world as I have, who are clear enough to be useful mirrors. So it's not that someone I'm close to I wouldn't want to hear if they had emotions or triggers so we could try to sort it out. But I find that I'm a lot more successful with people who have learn to really remember that we're on the same team even when they're triggered with me. And one of the things that hasn't come up in a while, who knows when it will again, but I think of it as my little girl wants to take her toys and go home. And in any of my close relationships, at some point, something's happened that just hit a really old, primal, painful place, a no that I didn't expect to get, or a lack of availability when I felt like I was really going through something and they should have showed up for me or whatever. And there's this desire to take my toys and go home. And I usually go sit in the hot tub and work with myself because no good comes of reaching out to people when I'm in that really primal place. But kind of the longing is for me to like stomp off and be like, leave me alone, and for them to chase after me and me to keep pushing them away, but them to keep chasing after me. And if you're not dealing with a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old where you're the mother, and that's very appropriate to do for a child that age, but for an adult, pretty much if you stomp off and say, I'm taking my toys and going home, it's valid if people are like, well, okay, you do you, boo. But that longing, again, I'm just speaking some of this shadow out loud because a lot of times I think it runs in the background. And if you're somebody who's like, gosh, I cannot relate to any of this. I cannot, I don't vilify people. I just can't find any of this. That's awesome. I love that you're not dealing with these things. And it may be a manual for seeing inside the head of some of the people who've been really friggin' peeved at you, who've been really, really, really unhappy with you. Just for the understanding and the discernment and understanding people across differences. So I know this is turning out to be an epically long episode. Obviously, I have a lot to say on this, which is cool. I love that there's this opportunity. So checked in with the heart. Oh, I really feel for her. She longs for connection and people and, this little microcosm of what I'm seeing about her, where the fullness of time hasn't brought perspective or seeing what her part might have been or getting curious about what was going on. She just really doubled down on the "you were wrong and I should have had this and you're a reprehensible person. I can't believe you did the thing." Like, oh, bummer. And then the solar plexus of being like, yep, that was a boundary I feel good and clear about. So then the next part was like that crown chakra and third eye. So I actually did a journey because I had all this compassion. I also still have the boundary, which is, I wasn't willing to do, unpaid time and emotional labor for you when you liked me. So I don't want to get into a whole thing where I'm providing unwelcome reflections and counseling and acknowledgement and all of this labor for somebody years ago who's on a path. And yet, if there's some way that I could respond that would, ideally alleviate, just cause less suffering, like, wow, that would be good. And so I journeyed on it and I asked the guides, I'm like, do I respond to this? Is there something I can do? And maybe something will occur to me that feels really brilliant. But what they said is, no, honey, she's vilified you in her mind. There's also really this hurt. There's this argument going on. I imagine, I don't look at other people without permission. But if I draw from my own experience of when I've behaved this way or some version of it, there's this dual part of like, I'm going to get relief by telling you how awful you are and putting you down and telling you how invalid you are. And there might be this other part that's just really like, wow, I really felt connected to you. And it's kind of a weird thing I do because I genuinely care about a lot of my clients. I have such compassion and such delight, and I'm so much in their corner. And that's very real. It's just also not a friendship where, I would call them up when I was having a bad night. And there's just an interesting aspect. So the experience of really having needs deeply met in that way, and then having that go away in the pain of it. So I was asking the guides, like, knowing that all these pieces, is there something I can do? And the information in the journey is no. She's already vilified you. She's made you the bad guy, and engagement is likely to stir the pot, and I'm not prepared to do a really big mea culpa. They're probably more generous people than me that could just, really go in and deeply acknowledge all of her feelings and not go into the story. But I'm not really available for that. And I do feel like the mirroring of not meeting needs for someone else when they participate in a really dysfunctional way is part of the mechanisms of feedback of the world. So my trying to go in and provide emotional and psychological relief in some complicated way, I just don't think it's a very functional strategy for getting relief. And my strategy in that way failing over and over again was good. So the upshot was, the information I really got in the journey was, yeah, she's using me as a mirror for a certain thing, and maybe she takes in a data point, maybe she doesn't. It's her journey. I so honor that. But there wasn't any way that I was invited. If she'd come to me, if she'd written like, I just still feel so hurt and so confused, and this is really hard, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to help me understand a little bit more about what happened. And if it's more than a few minutes, I'll pay you for your time. Like if I'd gotten that email from her, I might have responded really, really differently and gifted her at least a little bit of time. And then if she wanted more to discuss it, I might have been available for that. But there was nothing in her email that wasn't about doubling down on the righteousness of her position. And as a result, the guides are like, nope, she's told a story about you, and she'll find other people to navigate with however she ends up doing it. It's so complicated to relate to people. So that was kind of the map. We deal with the second chakra first when there are these disruptions, because it is so primal when people are upset with us or don't like us. And then, we can see what's happening in the heart chakra, happening in the solar plexus, how we feel about how we behaved, how we feel good about going forward. And for me, again, I just took counsel with the guides because a lot of times we get locked into our particular ways of responding to things. And I just wanted to see if there was another option. And maybe there is. Maybe there's something really elegant that hasn't come to me yet. But for now, I'm kind of going against type where, it's like, I hate lack of closure. I really want to respond, but I don't feel like there's any response I could give that would improve the situation, that would do well by her and be honoring of me. And so as a result, at least for now, I'm just going to leave it and really utilize all the introspection that came up because I think it can be really helpful. And I just want to conclude by reiterating the point that if you're in that cycle where there's been a wound, there's been something that hurt, and there's a whole range, there are things that are on the extreme where, any non-psychopathic person would be like, wow, that person crossed a line. We have a lot of laws related to that. So if it's something that they would be jailed for or in community service for something, for sure, that's one end of the spectrum. And then there's gray area where, people are messy and clumsy and not graceful and conflict avoidant. I have a whole podcast on, why I really appreciate when people take the time to have endings, but there are a lot of people who just are otherwise really psychologically and emotionally healthy who avoid difficult conversations, who just won't cough up the truth with really important people who are building a well of resentment and hurt because they never learned the skill set to have a productive, difficult conversation. And the experiences they've had of sitting on all the emotion and then exploding went south like you would expect. So I just want to really kind of reiterate, if you've fallen into that cycle where your mind is constructing a court case against the validity of the person, how horrible they are, how wrong they are, and again, there's this huge spectrum of people just moving really congruently and appropriate through the world and having people be super triggered with them. It's been quite a while ago, but I had one gal who just got, so mad at me. She's like, you're not loving. It's like a business. And I just boundaried with like, I'm happy to support you, but it needs to be in session. And she didn't like hearing the no. And I'm like, well, I mean, I am in business. This is what I do for a living. We have no relationship. You've done one session with me. You want a bunch of my time for free. I'm not down for that. I'm super clear about that. And I got this whole angry email about how not loving I was. I'm like, okay, I can live with that. So we can be, really moving through the world in a clear way and have people project their stuff on us, or we can project onto other people. And then there are things that are, questionable. And then there are things that are outright reprehensive. There's, a whole spectrum. But I would argue that it's kind of an energy leak, especially if it goes on for a long time. I said kind of, but I really think it is an energy leak. If we are ruminating on the horrible invalidness of someone else's way of being in the world and way of moving through the world. And this isn't to say we should just snap our fingers and get over it. I wish we could. I would love that for all of us. There may be pain and disappointment, and someone's actions may have hit on a really old wound that could use some attention and caring, and we may have been startled, so it may make us feel really unsafe in the world that we got surprised. There's a lot of stuff that comes up, but I would argue that this case of someone's not being okay, it's not okay for them to be the way they are, and ruminating on that is a protection from feeling our emotions. And I just don't think it's necessarily, if we stay stuck in that for a long time, it's a path forward to healing. And for me, looking at this fellow who, decided to end our relationship by just no longer talking to me, for me, it's kind of a litmus test where I'm like, okay, it's coming up in my mind. When I notice, I'm appreciating that I noticed, and I'm coming back to center, which is what I really believe, which is, well, I'm not going to be involved with him anymore. I don't foresee a path unless he cleaned that up with me where we would even be friends. And that's just, a truth. It's something that really works for me. And so it's handled unless there's new information or a new experience. If I'm focusing on this, how can I come back to myself? And I know that when I've completed my emotional cycle, it'll stop popping into my head. I've had any number of people who participated romantically with me in a way that really wasn't to my taste, and they just don't cross my mind these days. I don't even think about them. And so there's a fullness of time, and I'm just giving myself patience. Like, yeah, that was really a mismatch for me as far as what would have worked as an ending. And that's the price of admission if I want to seek, sexual, connection and friendship and depth with people, which I really do. I really like those experiences. So, alrighty, let me work on restoring myself. And to be honest, I have a lot of other things going on in my life right now, but my dating ads are down for a little while because I don't want to add the emotional complexity. And at some point they'll be back up and I'll be back in the game. But this journey, I just have been kind of reviewing how effective the worldviews that I really consciously cultivated and developed with a lot of interpersonal work really serve, and using that framework. And gosh darn it, there's still this vulnerability to going back to, this really old, I think, primal experience we have. And so I know there's a lot here. People can be in a lot of different places on the path, but I hope there's something that acts as a compass and helps point you and move you in a direction that has more success in relating with other humans, because there's so much joy in authentic, healthy, sustainable connection. And I hope that this, unlocks some more possibilities for you. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.